All right, everyone, we are getting a huge update tonight in Grand Cross Global, and not only are we getting the training cave, but we are also getting equipment engraving stones and hammers of Vizel. Now, both of these resources are incredibly important to make sure that you don't waste them, but what I wanted to focus on today is the hammers of Vizel, and I wanted to share with you guys all the information you're going to want to know so that you don't waste this resource, because hammers are a very big bottleneck resource, and that means you feel like you're not going to get enough of them compared to how many you want to use. They're going to always feel very limited, and that's because they are very powerful. And I also mentioned that hammers are the primary thing that I'm actually waiting for to be introduced in the game for me to spend my gold on the equipment draw as well. So hopefully with this update, they'll also add them here so that I can spend a bunch of gold and see how many hammers I get. Now, when it comes to the equipment draw, something that you'll notice is when they are actually added, the drop rate of hammers is going to be very low. Now, looking at the drop rate of anvils, we are looking at a 5.36%, the same as the 4-star awakening stones. And hammers should be around 0.8%, which will be the same as those 5-star awakening stones. Now, that's a low chance to get, but that also signifies how important hammers are and the fact that they are indeed considered to be more valuable than anvils. So it's important to understand that when it comes to using them so that you don't use too many of them on not important items. So let's kind of go through a checklist here of the things you want to pay attention to before you actually use your hammers so that they don't end up going to waste. So let me open up my hero menu here, and we're going to use Escanor as the example here. I don't think anybody's going to get tired of looking at Escanor. And keep in mind that I'm just using this common gear as an example. That's also why he doesn't have any other gear. And this leads me to the very first thing on the checklist is any time that you can actually use gold as a resource to reroll the stats on gear, you do not want to use other resources, because obviously gold, the 10,000 gold or so that it takes to reroll is going to be much easier in order to get than the very valuable limited resources like anvils and hammers. So this is going to apply to common, uncommon, and rare items. Now, after rare, you can no longer use gold in order to reroll, and that leaves you with the SR and SSRs, which will only have either the anvils or the gems. Now, when it comes to SR and SSR, the next thing on the checklist is never use those resources on SR gear. In fact, you should just not work on any SR gear altogether, because it's kind of in that awkward position where you've now moved past rare gear where you can't use gold to reroll it, but it's not as good as SSR gear, so it's just kind of like you're permanently gimping yourself if you decide to dump resources into SR gear, which is why I would never recommend it. So that's next up on the checklist, is you want it to be an SSR piece of gear. Now, next up here is the actual basic stat. So all of the items that you get to drop are going to have a range on their basic stat, and it's going to be random when you actually get it. Now, just like with rerolling, when it comes to common, uncommon, and rares, you could reroll the basic stats for gold. However, when it comes to your SR and SSRs, you'll no longer have that option. If you ever do want to reroll the basic stats, it would cost you gems, which is obviously a no-go. So you do not want to spend gems to reroll something that you dumped a lot of resources in and then realize afterwards, oh man, the basic stats really suck. What was I thinking? Now I have to spend gems to reroll it. Save yourself that whole headache, and just make sure that before you start investing resources, obviously including the valuable ones like anvils and hammers, make sure that the basic roll is good. Now, it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be like this right here. That's actually crazy that I even got this to drop. Very unlikely. So 390 to 520. My general rule of thumb is try to go for something in the top 10%. So for this, let's see, the range is 130, so that would be like the top 15 or so. I would say like anything 505, anything in the 500s really should be fine. You can even dip a little bit below that if you're really lazy and you just don't like to farm free quests for gear, but anything lower than that, like especially anywhere in the bottom end, just don't use it. Don't invest heavy resources into it. And at that point, you would just +1 or +5 the gear and then salvage it for the actual resources. So that's kind of the next thing on the actual checklist. Now we're getting to the important stuff here, and that is the distinction between anvils and hammers, and why hammers are not only more rare, but why they're considered much more valuable than anvils. So when it comes to the bonus rolls, first of all, you're going to actually need to get the roll that you are looking for. So, a lot of the times it's only going to be one thing, You know, maybe for bracelets, that might be two things. Like if you're, you know, if Pierce is also okay and attack is also okay. Either way, though, there's going to be some rolls that you have that you're not going to want. And in that case, you're going to want to use anvils to actually get what you are looking for. Now, hammers, they won't actually re-roll the actual type here. So, like, it won't go from attack to pierce rate or pierce rate to attack or, you know, crit chance to attack or any of that sort of nonsense. It will always stay at the roll that it actually is when it comes to hammers. So, that's really important because obviously when you actually get the roll that you want, if it's not really high, like let's just say you're not really happy with this 1.9% attack, right? Well, if I wanted to use anvils now to re-roll it, 3/4 of the time, it's going to roll off of attack, right? It's going to roll pierce rate, crit chance, crit damage. And if you don't want any of those stats on the gear, then 3/4 of the time, it doesn't even matter what percentage pierce rate, crit chance, or crit damage it rolls because you're just looking for attack. So right off the bat, you can see how almost in a way you can think of hammers as like 4 times as valuable as anvils. Just, you know, it's not quite like that, but just think of it a little bit like that because it allows you to actually keep the roll that you want. So that's the first thing right there. Now, the other thing that's really important about hammers is that they are not going to actually roll your stat lower than what you already have. And this is huge because with anvils, not only can it actually change the actual type of roll, like attack to pierce or, you know, crit chance to whatever, but it can also roll lower than what you already have. And it's completely random. So think of the intervals, right? With attack, you can go 1 to 3%. And the intervals are 0.1%, right? So 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, and so on and so forth, all the way up to 3%. So each of those is a possible outcome. But then you have all the other possible outcomes on all the other stats, like pierce, crit, and crit damage. So there's a lot of different things that you can roll. It's completely random, and a lot of the times you're actually just going to end up rolling on something lower than what you already have, even if you get lucky and you actually landed on getting attack again. So, you know, at 1.9%, for example, you know, if I wanted to get 2% or higher attack, well, because the range is 1 to 3%, right, only a third of the time am I actually going to end up getting 2% or higher. And then on top of that, only a quarter of the time am I even going to land on attack again. 3/4 of the time, it'll be something else. So, quick math here, that means that it's going to take an average of 12 full rerolls, which at 5 anvils a pop for SSR gear, you're looking at 60 anvils on average in order to end up getting a attack 2.0% plus or higher roll. And as you get higher and higher stats, it's going to take more anvils on average in order to perfect your gear. And it makes sense, right? As you get better stats, it takes more resources to improve upon those stats. Well, this is where hammers come in incredibly handy. It's because hammers aren't going to reroll off of attack, and they're not going to roll lower than this 1.9%. It will stay attack, and it will always be an improvement. Always. Now, the improvement can be really low. It can end up being the minimum, which would be 0.1%. In fact, it's going to end up being that a lot. And as you get a higher and higher roll, you know, the higher it gets to perfect, obviously the lower chance that it's going to be in order for it to upgrade a really large amount at once. And it makes sense, right? Again, it's the same concept of the higher you get to perfect stats, the more resources you have to put in order to actually, you know, improve your stats more. But either way, you still don't end up risking the fact of, you know, rolling off of the stat that you want, like attack, and you also don't risk getting a lower stat. So huge advantages, and that is why hammers are so valuable. Now, the really big question here is, you know, what is that point now where I want to end up switching from using anvils to hammers? When do I actually put them to use? Well, now that you know this information, you want to ask yourself a very important question when it comes to rerolling your gear. The answer is going to be slightly different depending on kind of your point in the game. Like, obviously, for whales, it's going to be a different answer than for free-to-play players, but the question is going to be the same either way. And that question is, if you end up getting a roll on a piece of gear, you know, what's that point now where it would be really painful for you if you ended up losing that roll? You know, like if I'm looking for attack on bracelets, I know for me, like 2.5%. It's kind of like that point where, you know, when I start using anvils to try to go for higher than 2.5% attack, you know, a lot of the times it's not going to happen. I'm going to roll attack again, but it's going to be, you know, 1 or 2%. You know, most of the time, it's very unlikely it's going to be higher than 2.5%. So you have to kind of find that point for you of, you know, where is it painful for you to take off something and try to risk rolling on it. Not only am I going to risk not actually getting attack again, but then I have to risk the fact with anvils of it rolling lower. So because you don't have to risk any of that with hammers, it really is like a very easy to use item, but it's very, very limited. And you want to make sure to absolutely always ask yourself that question before you actually use them. Because, you know, let's just say you use hammers on an attack 1.0% roll. This is an example of where you would not want to use hammers, because 1.0 is the absolute minimum roll. So if I were to go back to using Anvil, sure, 3/4 of the time I'm not going to end up rolling on attack, but when I do land on attack again, unless I get super unlucky and roll the exact minimum again twice in a row, which it's actually happened to me before, I'm sure it's happened to some of you guys as well, but it's unlikely, and most of the time it would end up rolling something higher than the absolute minimum. So I would not want to use hammers on a stat that is 1.0. Now, the hammers will have a higher chance to improve it with something other than a minimum roll, but still, you know, that's kind of the threshold where you want to lean towards anvils more so. And it really is because hammers are so limited. You know, if we had more of them available, I would say go for it and re-roll the 1.0 rolls. But because we just don't have that many of them, you want to make sure to be very picky and find that kind of threshold of, man, this is the point where it's going to be really painful for me to try to re-roll and get this stat again. Now, obviously, if you're a whale, that threshold might be better. It might be like 2.8 or 2.9%. And mathematically, actually, the best point possible to use hammers is at 2.9%, because you're never going to get lower, and it's always going to go up by 0.1%. But just because that's mathematically the best point to use them doesn't mean that that's practically where, you know, most people want to use their hammers. Because I don't know about you, but if I get a 2.9% on a piece of SSR gear, I am a-okay with that, and I am moving on to another stat that is not anywhere even close to that high. Hammers, anvils, it doesn't matter. I'm taking my 2.9% and going with it. So, but it's a tricky item, and it's also tricky because of how limited it is, and you really do not want these to end up going to waste. So I wanted to put this video out there. Hopefully you guys learned a little bit more about anvils, hammers, kind of the differences between the two, why hammers are considered more valuable, and how you want to make sure to use them properly given how scarce they are going to be. So if you guys enjoyed this video and you want more videos like this in the future, consider subscribing to the channel. Feel free to leave a quick like as well. It means more than you can imagine. So thank you so much to all of you guys who decide to leave a quick like. And we are getting close to 4,000 subscribers. So thank you so much for all the support, everyone. Really do appreciate it. And more 7 Deadly Sins Grand Cross Global videos should be popping up on the screen right about now. Feel free to check them out. Plenty of helpful guides and videos like this on the channel for all sorts of stuff. So if you're looking for that, keep an eye out. More videos coming soon. This is Salt of the Salty Guild, signing out.